The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystal spires of Alderan Prime as librarian Sarah Chun adjusted her reading glasses and opened an ancient tome about Earth's medieval period. The massive library she tended stretched for miles in every direction, its crystalline walls holding the collected knowledge of 47 different species from across the galaxy. Most beings found the sheer volume of information overwhelming, but Sarah had always believed that knowledge was meant to be absorbed slowly, like fine wine. The peaceful quiet of her sanctuary was broken by the thunderous roar of engines overhead. Through the transparent ceiling, she could see the distinctive black hulls of Kralaxian war vessels descending through the atmosphere like hungry vultures. Their ships bore the crimson markings of the Death Legion, the most feared military force in 3 sectors of space. Sarah didn't look up from her book. The other species working in the library began to panic. A group of blueskins and Therians scrambled toward the emergency exits, their multiple arms flailing in distress. Several crystalline Vorthack scholars shattered their protective casings in their haste to escape. Even the normally stoic mechanical collective units began broadcasting distress signals and retreating to their charging stations. Librarian Shun called out Vexhai, a 6-legged insectoid researcher who had been studying human military history for the past 3 years. His compound eyes reflected genuine concern as he approached her reading desk. The Kralaxians have come to claim this world. Their reputation precedes them. They've conquered 17 systems in the past year alone. Perhaps we should consider evacuation protocols. Sarah turned a page in her book about the Battle of Agincourt, her finger tracing the text as she read about English longbowmen facing impossible odds. Did you know that Henry V's army was outnumbered nearly 5-1 at Agincourt? She asked conversationally. The French had every advantage: better armor, more soldiers, cavalry support. But they underestimated human determination. With respect, librarian, this is not a historical debate. Those are real warships approaching, and Kralaxians don't negotiate. No, they don't, Sarah agreed pleasantly, finally, looking up from her book. Her brown eyes held an odd calmness that seemed completely at odds with the chaos erupting around them. They're rather like the Mongols in that regard. Overwhelming force, psychological warfare, complete destruction of resistance. Fascinating military doctrine, really. The building shook as the first Kralaxian dropships landed in the plaza outside. Through the walls, they could hear the distinctive hiss and clank of powered armor as the alien warriors disembarked. The Kralaxians were an impressive sight to behold, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with thick, scale hide that could deflect most energy weapons. Their technological superiority was matched only by their ruthless efficiency in warfare. Librarian, Vexhai pleaded, "We must leave now." Sarah closed her book gently and stood up from her chair. She walked to the central console of the library and began typing commands with practiced ease. Actually, I think I'll stay and tend to my books. Someone needs to keep the library running. After all, they'll kill you, perhaps. Sarah's fingers danced across the controls, and suddenly, the air above the library shimmered with energy. Or perhaps they'll learn something about human nature that their military databases haven't taught them. The shimmer in the air began to solidify, and Vexhai's eyes widened in terror and amazement. Emerging from what appeared to be a dimensional rift was a creature that belonged in the realm of legend. It was a dragon, but not like the small, domesticated WIRMS that some species used as pets. This was something ancient and magnificent, easily 200 feet from nose to tail, with scales that seemed to absorb light and reflect it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The dragon's eyes were like molten gold, and when it spoke, its voice resonated through dimensions that most beings couldn't even perceive. "You called, little librarian?" Sarah smiled and picked up her book again. "Hello, Pyraxis. Yes, we have some visitors who seem to think they own this place. Would you mind terribly helping them understand that libraries are neutral ground?" The dragon's massive head turned toward the plaza where the Kralaxian forces were forming up. 3 full companies of their best warriors, armed with plasma rifles and quantum disruptors, backed by heavy armor units that could level city blocks. To most species, it would have been an insurmountable force. Pyraxis chuckled, and the sound made the crystal walls of the library sing in harmony. These little ones believe their metal toys make them mighty? How quaint. The first Kralaxian squad kicked down the library's main entrance, their leader barking orders in their harsh, guttural language. They wore full battle armor that enhanced their already considerable physical abilities and carried weapons that could punch holes through starship hulls. Their commander, a massive specimen even by Kralaxian standards, stepped forward and activated his translation matrix. By order of the Kralaxian Empire, this facility is now property of the Death Legion. All personnel will surrender immediately or be executed as enemy combatants. Sarah didn't look up from her book. She had moved on to a chapter about the defense of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans had held off an army of hundreds of thousands. "I'm sorry," she called out pleasantly, "but this is a library. We don't allow weapons inside." The Kralaxian commander's 4 eyes blazed with fury. No one had ever spoken to him with such casual dismissal, especially not a fragile human. "You dare mock the might of the Death Legion? We have conquered worlds. We have brought entire species to their knees." "I'm sure you have," Sarah replied, turning another page. "But this is still a library, and libraries have rules." The commander raised his plasma rifle, its energy cells glowing with deadly intent. "Then, you will die for your impudence." That was when Pyraxis descended. The ancient dragon dropped from his position near the ceiling like a falling mountain, his massive form moving with impossible grace and speed. The Kralaxian commander had time to fire exactly 1 shot before 6 tons of scaled fury landed directly on top of him. The plasma bolt went wide, striking a decorative crystal formation and sending rainbow shards scattering across the floor. The other Kralaxians opened fire immediately, their disciplined military training taking over. Plasma bolts and quantum disruptor beams filled the air, but Pyraxis moved through them like they were gentle rain. His scales deflected energy weapons with contemptuous ease, and his massive claws swept through the alien warriors like they were made of tissue paper. "Fascinating," Sarah murmured, making a note in the margin of her book. The psychological impact of facing a predator species that exists outside their understanding of conventional warfare. Rather like how the conquistadors' horses affected the Aztecs. One of the surviving Kralaxians managed to activate his emergency communicator. "Command, we're under attack by an unknown entity. Request immediate reinforcement." The response came back within seconds. "Understood. Deploying 2nd and 3rd companies. Prepare for orbital bombardment if necessary." Sarah finally looked up from her book with mild interest. "Oh dear, they're escalating. Pyraxis, would you mind stepping outside? I'd rather not have the library damaged in all this unpleasantness." The dragon was in the process of using his tail to bat a group of Kralaxians across the plaza like cosmic ping-pong balls. "Of course, dear librarian. Wouldn't want to damage your precious books." As Pyraxis moved the battle outside, Sarah returned to her reading, occasionally glancing up to watch the proceedings through the transparent walls. More Kralaxian dropships were landing, disgorging additional warriors and heavy weapons platforms. She could see them setting up quantum mortars and plasma cannons, preparing for a sustained siege. It was then that she noticed Vexhai still crouched behind a nearby bookshelf, too terrified to move, but apparently too fascinated to look away. "You're still here," she observed. I cannot believe what I am witnessing," the insectoid scholar whispered. "That creature, what is it?" Sarah marked her place in the book with a leather bookmark her grandmother had given her 40 years ago. "Pyraxis is what humans call a dragon. We've had a partnership for quite some time now. I provide him with interesting reading material, and he provides security services when needed. But dragons are mythological. They exist only in human folklore." "Do they?" Sarah asked with a gentle smile. "Humans have believed in dragons for thousands of years, across every culture, on every continent. We've told stories about them, written books about them, dreamed about them. Where do you suppose all that belief goes, Vex High? Outside, Pyraxis was demonstrating exactly where all that belief had gone. The Kralaxian heavy weapons were having no more effect on him than their personal arms had. He moved through their formations like a force of nature, his breath weapon turning advanced military vehicles into pools of molten metal. When the Kralaxians tried to retreat to a safe distance, he took to the air, his massive wings casting shadows over the entire plaza as he pursued them with casual efficiency. "This is impossible," Vexhai whispered. "No single creature could stand against an entire military company." "You're thinking like a scientist," Sarah said, reopening her book. "But some things exist beyond the realm of pure science. Humans learned long ago that stories have power, that myths can become reality if enough people believe in them strongly enough. Pyraxis exists because humanity needed him to exist." The battle outside was becoming increasingly one-sided. The Kralaxian forces had superior numbers, advanced technology, and centuries of military experience, but they were trying to fight something that operated according to different rules entirely. Pyraxis wasn't just a large predator with tough scales. He was the embodiment of every story humans had ever told about dragons, every legend about mighty WRMS protecting what they cherished most. And Sarah-chan was what he cherished most in all the galaxy. The Kralaxian Orbital Command, watching the battle unfold through surveillance drones, made the decision to escalate to weapons of mass destruction. A beam of pure energy descended from space, targeting the library directly. It was the kind of weapon that could crack planetary crusts and boil oceans. Pyraxis caught it. The ancient dragon simply opened his mouth and swallowed the orbital strike like it was a particularly interesting appetizer. The energy that should have destroyed half the continent disappeared into his gullet without so much as a burp. "Now, that was just rude," Sarah commented, not bothering to look up from her description of Roman military tactics. "Orbital bombardment of a library? Really, what has civilization come to?" The Kralaxian fleet commander, War Marshal Zethkrar, stared at his tactical displays in complete disbelief. His instruments showed that their most powerful orbital strike cannon had fired successfully, delivering enough energy to vaporize a small moon. The same instruments also showed that the target was completely undamaged and that something had actually absorbed the entire blast. "Run full spectrum analysis on that creature," he barked to his science officer. "I want to know what we're dealing with." The science officer, a smaller Kralaxian with cybernetic implants covering half his skull, worked frantically at his console. "Sir, the readings don't make sense. The creature appears to be generating energy signatures that our instruments can't properly classify. It's almost as if it exists partially outside normal space-time. That's impossible. Nothing can exist outside the laws of physics." Down on the planet's surface, Pyraxis was proving that impossibility was simply a matter of perspective. The dragon had grown tired of swatting individual Kralaxians and had begun to demonstrate why ancient Earth legend spoke of dragons as world-ending forces. He breathed not fire, but something far more primal, a flame that seemed to burn away the very concept of the Kralaxian military superiority. Where his breath touched their vehicles, they didn't just melt or explode. They simply ceased to be vehicles and became something else entirely. Advanced plasma tanks transformed into flowering gardens. Dropships became crystalline sculptures that sang haunting melodies in languages no living being had ever heard. Personal armor suits turned their occupants into living statues that would spend eternity contemplating the nature of hubris. "Sir," another officer called from the communication station. "We're receiving a transmission from the planetary surface. It's from the human." "The human?" Zethkrar's four eyes narrowed. "That insignificant creature is still alive." "Yes, sir. She's requesting to speak with you." The War Marshal's pride warred with his curiosity. No human had ever directly addressed a Kralaxian fleet commander. Their species was considered so weak and unremarkable that most Kralaxian databases classified them as barely above vermin. But The impossible creature defending the library had somehow emerged from the human facility, and nothing in his military experience had prepared him for this situation. Put her through, he finally decided. Let's hear what the little insect has to say. Sarah-chan appeared on the main view screen, sitting calmly at her library desk with an open book in her hands. Behind her, through the transparent walls, Pyraxis could be seen playfully chasing a squad of Kralaxian elite warriors who were running for their lives while screaming in their native tongue. "Good afternoon, War Marshal," Sarah said politely, exactly as if she were greeting a library patron who had come to check out a book. "I'm Sarah Chun, head librarian of the Valdaran Prime Central Repository. I understand you believe you're here to conquer this world." Zethkrar bared his fangs in what passed for a threatening expression among his species. "Human, you will order that creature to stand down immediately, or I will reduce your entire continent to radioactive ash." Sarah looked thoughtful for a moment. "I'm afraid that's not really how our relationship works. Pyraxis isn't my pet or my weapon. He's my friend, and friends protect each other when rude visitors try to cause trouble." "Your friend?" The War Marshal's laugh was like the sound of grinding metal. "That thing is a weapon of mass destruction masquerading as a biological entity. No friendship exists between species so vastly different in power." "Oh dear," Sarah said sadly. "You really don't understand friendship at all, do you?" "That explains quite a lot about Kralaxian military doctrine. Actually, I've been reading about your conquest patterns for the past few hours, and I notice you've never encountered effective resistance before. Always overwhelming force against weaker opponents. Rather like bullying, really." The insult struck deep into Zethkar's warrior pride. "We are the greatest military force in the galaxy. We have conquered 47 star systems." "Yes, but only ones that couldn't fight back effectively," Sarah pointed out reasonably. "You've built an entire civilization around picking on species weaker than yourselves. It's actually quite sad when you think about it. All that military might, and you've never learned what real courage looks like." On the planet below, Pyraxis had finished playing with the Kralaxian ground forces and was now sitting peacefully outside the library like an enormous, scaly cat. The surviving warriors had barricaded themselves behind their damaged vehicles and were apparently holding a heated debate about whether retreat was tactically sound or simply cowardice. "You dare lecture me about courage?" Zethkrar roared. "You cower behind a monster while your betters discuss your fate." Sarah finally looked up from her book, and for just a moment, the War Marshal caught a glimpse of something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It wasn't fear or anger or even defiance. It was the calm, steady gaze of someone who had looked into the heart of the universe and found it wanting. "I'm not cowering behind anything," she said quietly. "I'm sitting in my library, reading a book, while my friend deals with some very rude visitors who seem to think that might makes right. The fact that you see this as me hiding behind a monster says more about you than it does about me." She held up the book she'd been reading. "This is a history of human warfare, War Marshal. Every page tells the story of someone like you, someone who thought superior numbers and better weapons guaranteed victory. The Romans thought that about the Germanic tribes. Napoleon thought that about the Russian winter. The British thought that about some colonial farmers with hunting rifles." Zethkrar leaned forward in his command chair. Despite himself, he was intrigued. Human military history was not something the Kralaxian Empire had bothered to study in detail. Their databases indicated that humans had never developed beyond primitive chemical weapons and crude nuclear devices. "And what did these superior forces learn, little human?" Sarah smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "They learned that humans have a very specific response to bullies, War Marshal. We don't just fight back. We become the thing that monsters check onto their beds for." As if summoned by her words, Pyraxis raised his massive head and looked directly at the Kralaxian fleet in orbit. Even through thousands of miles of empty space, through the view screen, through the layers of advanced shielding, every Kralaxian on every ship could feel the dragon's attention like a weight pressing down on their souls. "Your creature cannot reach us here," Zethkrar said, "but His voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Can't he?" Sarah asked mildly. "How do you suppose dragons learn to fly, War Marshal? Do you think it was always just atmospheric flight?" The dragon spread his wings, and suddenly they were no longer simply physical appendages. They became vast sails that caught currents of space-time itself, dimensional membranes that could ride the solar winds between stars. Pyraxis launched himself upward, not through the atmosphere, but through the fundamental structure of reality itself. "Impossible," breathed the science officer. "He's flying through space without any form of life support or propulsion system." "Sir," called the weapons officer, "all targeting systems are showing errors. We can't get a lock on the creature. It's like it exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously." Zethkrar watched in growing horror as the dragon approached his flagship. The creature was moving through space like it was simply another form of atmosphere, its wings catching forces that Kralaxian science insisted didn't exist. Worse, it was growing larger as it approached, as if distance was merely a suggestion rather than a physical law. "All ships, open fire," he commanded. "Concentrate all weaponry on that target." The Kralaxian fleet opened up with everything they had: plasma cannons, quantum disruptors, antimatter torpedoes, and exotic particle beams filled the space around Pyraxis with enough destructive energy to sterilize entire worlds. The dragon flew through the barrage like it was a gentle spring rain, apparently more amused than threatened. When he reached the flagship, Pyraxis didn't attack. Instead, he simply perched on the hull like a cosmic bird, his weight somehow not crushing the ship despite his obvious mass. He folded his wings and settled down comfortably, then turned his ancient golden eyes toward the bridge where Zethkrar stood frozen in terror. "Hello, little warrior." The dragon's voice spoke directly into every mind on every ship, bypassing communication systems entirely. "The librarian would like to have a word with you." Back on the planet, Sarah had put down her book and was now addressing the fleet directly through the communication system. "War Marshal, I think we need to discuss the terms of your immediate departure from this system." "Terms?" Zethkrar managed to croak. The dragon's presence was overwhelming every sensor on his ship, and he was beginning to understand that he was dealing with something far beyond his military experience. "Oh yes," Sarah said pleasantly. "You see, you've committed several serious breaches of galactic library protocols, bringing weapons onto library grounds, threatening library staff, attempting to destroy library property. These are not trivial offenses." The War Marshal tried to regain his composure. "You cannot threaten the Kralaxian Empire. We have fleets that could turn your entire world to ash." "Could you?" Sarah asked with genuine curiosity. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you can't even handle one dragon and a librarian. But let's say you're right. Let's say you could bring enough ships to overwhelm Pyraxis through sheer numbers. What do you think would happen then?" She paused to let the question sink in before continuing. "You see, War Marshal, Pyraxis isn't unique. He's just the first dragon to awaken. Humans have been telling dragon stories for thousands of years, across dozens of worlds now. Every time we establish a colony, we bring our myths with us. And every time someone threatens what we care about, those myths remember why they exist." On the flagship's hull, Pyraxis chuckled, and the vibration resonated through the ship's superstructure like a warning bell. "She's quite right, you know. There are hundreds of my kind sleeping in the spaces between human dreams. Some guard treasure, some guard knowledge, and some guard the people who believe in them. But we all share one trait in common." "What's that?" Zethkrar whispered. "We really don't like bullies." The dragon's eyes began to glow brighter, and suddenly the War Marshal could see things that his instruments couldn't detect. In the space around human colonies throughout the galaxy, massive shapes stirred in dimensions that overlapped with normal space. Ancient intelligences that had slept in the collective unconscious of humanity for millennia were beginning to wake up. "This is what you don't understand about humans," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly across space. "We're not just individuals. We're a collective story that's been building for thousands of years. Every myth, every legend, Every tale told around a campfire becomes part of who we are. And when you threaten us, you're not just threatening flesh and blood. You're threatening the stories themselves. Zethkar looked around his bridge at his officers, all of whom were staring at their instruments in growing panic. The readings they were getting from space around them defied every law of physics they knew. Reality itself seemed to be shifting in response to the humans' words. "What do you want?" he finally asked. Sarah smiled and picked up her book again. "I want you to leave this system and never return. I want you to update your databases to reflect that libraries are neutral ground, not to be threatened by military forces. And I want you to spread the word to other conquest fleets that humanity is under the protection of forces they wouldn't understand, even if they spent 1,000 years studying them. And if we refuse..." Pyraxis stretched his wings, and for a moment they seemed to encompass the entire fleet. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every dragon story ever told, every legend of winged fire and ancient wisdom. "Then you'll learn why humans stopped believing in monsters, little warrior. It's because we became friends with the things that eat monsters." The silence that followed Pyraxis's words stretched across space like a hell breath. War Marshal Zethkar stared at his tactical displays, watching impossible readings cascade across his screens. His fleet, the pride of the Kralaxian Empire, had been reduced to cosmic insignificance by a single creature that shouldn't exist, and a human librarian who spoke of myths as if they were military assets. "Sir," his science officer whispered, "I'm detecting massive gravitational anomalies throughout the system. Something is arriving." Zethkar didn't need instruments to sense what was coming. The very fabric of space around them began to shimmer, and through those shimmers came shapes that belonged in children's nightmares and ancient legends. Dragons emerged from the spaces between stars, each one unique, each one carrying the weight of human imagination behind it. There was Smog the Mighty, golden scales reflecting the light of distant suns as he coiled through the vacuum like a serpent of living metal. Bahamut the Platinum descended from dimensions where justice was a physical force, his presence making every weapon system on every Kralaxian ship hesitate, as if uncertain of their moral authority to function. Ancient WRMS whose names were lost to history, but whose essence lived on in human dreams, filled the space around the fleet, their eyes like burning stars. "Fascinating," Sarah commented from the planet below, making a note in her book. "I haven't seen this many of them gather since the Terran Liberation Wars." "You should feel honored, War Marshal. It takes quite a significant threat to wake up the entire Dragon Council." Zethkar's voice cracked as he spoke. "This is impossible. Mass hallucination. Some form of human psychic warfare." "Is it?" Sarah asked gently. "Your instruments are detecting them, aren't they? They're showing up on gravitational sensors, energy readings, mass detectors. If they're hallucinations, they're remarkably solid ones." On the surface, Vexhai the insectoid scholar had emerged from his hiding place and was frantically recording everything he witnessed. His academic mind struggled to process what he was seeing, but his survival instincts told him he was witnessing something that would reshape galactic understanding of human capabilities. "Librarian Shun," he called out, his voice shaking with awe and terror. "How is this possible? How can mythology manifest in physical reality?" Sarah looked up from her book and smiled warmly. "Because humans never really distinguished between what was real and what was true. We told stories about dragons for thousands of years because we needed dragons to exist. We needed something magnificent and terrible and wise to watch over the things we cherished most. Knowledge, treasure, the innocent, the places where wisdom lived." She gestured toward the sky where the assembled dragons were arranging themselves in formation around the Kralaxian fleet. "The universe is stranger than any of us imagine, Vexhai. Human belief, focused and sustained across generations, creates its own form of reality. We call them myths, but they're really blueprints for forces that exist in dimensions we're only beginning to understand." Above them, Pyraxis had been joined by his ancient kin. The eldest dragon present was a creature so old that stars had been born and died during his first slumber. His scales were like crystallized time itself, and when he spoke, galaxies paused to listen. "I am Aeon," the Ancient One announced, his voice carrying across space without any need for technological amplification. "I have watched civilizations rise and fall like waves upon cosmic shores. I have seen the birth of wisdom and the death of empires. And in all my eons of existence, I have learned one fundamental truth about the universe." The Kralaxian fleet hung motionless in space, every warrior aboard transfixed by the presence of beings that existed beyond their understanding of possible. What truth? Zethkar found himself asking, though he hadn't intended to speak. That those who protect knowledge and nurture wisdom will always triumph over those who seek only to destroy and conquer. The universe itself favors creation over destruction, growth over stagnation, learning over ignorance. Sarah nodded approvingly. Aeon understands something that military minds often miss, War Marshal. Power without wisdom is just destruction waiting to happen. Your empire has built itself on the principle that might makes right, but that's only true until you encounter something mightier. The assembled dragons began to circle the Kralaxian fleet, not aggressively, but with the casual interest of cosmic predators evaluating potential prey. Each movement they made sent ripples through space-time that the Kralaxian instruments couldn't properly interpret. "We could end you," Bahamut observed conversationally. "Your ships, your fleet, your entire empire could be reduced to cosmic dust with barely an effort. But the Librarian has asked us to give you a choice instead." "What choice?" Zethkar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Down on the planet, Sarah closed her book and stood up from her desk. For the first time since the crisis began, she walked to the center of the library and activated the main holographic display system. Suddenly, her image was projected not just to the Kralaxian fleet, but to every ship in the system, every monitoring station, every communication array within a dozen light years. "The choice is simple," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the galaxy where Kralaxian forces operated. "You can continue as you have, conquering the weak and bullying the defenseless until you eventually meet something that destroys you utterly. Or you can learn." The image shifted, showing historical records from across human space. Worlds where humans had established libraries, research stations, and centers of learning. Places where knowledge was preserved and shared freely with any species willing to approach peacefully. "Humans don't seek to conquer other species," Sarah continued. "We seek to understand them. We collect their stories, preserve their histories, and help them grow beyond what they were. It's what we do. It's who we are." War Marshal Zethkar stared at the images of human colonies, tried to reconcile them with everything he thought he knew about galactic politics. These weren't military installations or resource extraction facilities. They were schools and libraries and research centers, places dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge rather than power. "Why?" he asked. "Why would any species choose knowledge over conquest?" Sarah's smile was sad but gentle. "Because conquest ends, War Marshal. Every empire falls eventually. Every conqueror dies. But knowledge endures. A story told to a child today might inspire them to save a civilization tomorrow. A book preserved in a library might contain a solution to a problem that won't arise for 1,000 years." She gestured to the dragons surrounding the fleet. "Do you know why these beings choose to protect human libraries and schools? It's not because we summoned them or created them. It's because we became worthy of their protection. We proved that we could be trusted with power by choosing wisdom instead." Aeon's ancient voice resonated through the fleet's communication systems. "The choice before you is the same one that faces every species eventually. You can remain predators, living only to consume and destroy until something stronger devours you in turn. Or you can evolve into something greater. And if we choose to evolve," Zethkar asked, "then you'll discover what humans learned long ago, Pyraxis rumbled with amusement. That the most powerful force in the universe isn't the ability to destroy. It's the ability to inspire others to become better than they thought possible. Sarah picked up a different book from her desk, this one bound in scales that seemed to shift color in the light. "This is the history of the Dragon Accord," she said, holding it up so the fleet's cameras could see it. "It's the story of how humanity learned to befriend forces beyond our understanding. Every species that's chosen wisdom over warfare has a place in this book. There's room for Kralaxian names, if you want there to be." The War Marshal looked around his bridge at his officers, seeing the same confusion and uncertainty in their faces that he felt in his own hearts. Everything they had been taught about galactic politics was being challenged by a single human and her impossible friends. "What would you require of us?" he asked finally. "Three things," Sarah replied promptly. "First, you withdraw from this system immediately and never return with hostile intent. Second, you spread the word throughout your empire that libraries and centers of learning are neutral ground, not to be threatened by military forces. Third, you send ambassadors to human space to learn about alternatives to conquest." That's all. Zethkar was surprised. He had expected demands for tribute, territory, or submission. "That's all," Sarah confirmed. "We're not interested in ruling you or punishing you. We just want you to stop hurting people and start learning." The dragons around the fleet began to sing, their voices creating harmonies that existed in dimensions beyond normal sound. The music told stories of civilizations that had chosen growth over destruction, species that had learned to reach for the stars with wisdom rather than weapons. Zethkar felt something shift inside his chest as he listened to the dragon's song. For the first time in his military career, he began to wonder what his people might accomplish if they applied their considerable abilities to building rather than destroying. "And if my superiors refuse these terms?" he asked. Sarah's expression grew serious. "Then they'll learn why dragons are considered the apex predators of human mythology, War Marshal. Not because they're the strongest or most destructive, but because they're the wisest. And wisdom knows when force is necessary." Aeon's voice carried a note of finality. "We have offered you the path of growth. Whether you take it or not is your choice. But understand that if you choose destruction, you will face every story humanity has ever told about justice triumphant and wisdom vindicated." The ancient dragon spread his wings, and for a moment they seemed to encompass all of human space. And human stories always in the same way when bullies refuse to learn. The monsters get exactly what they deserve. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. Zethkar stared at the impossible sight of dragons singing in space, while a human librarian offered his people a chance to become something better than they were. For the first time in his life, the War Marshal began to consider that there might be forms of strength that didn't involve weapons. 3 standard galactic months later, the first Kralaxian cultural exchange vessel approached the human research station at New Alexandria. War Marshal Zethkar, now bearing the title of Scholar Ambassador, stood on the observation deck watching the massive station grow larger as they approached. The facility was unlike anything in Kralaxian space, more organic than manufactured, with graceful curves and transparent sections that allowed natural light to flow throughout its structure. "It's beautiful," admitted Subcommander Raxtai, Zethkar's former weapons officer who now served as his cultural liaison. "I expected more defensive installations." "Humans don't think like us," Zethkar replied, his 4 eyes tracking the gentle movement of ships around the station. The vessels weren't warships, but research craft, cargo haulers carrying knowledge rather than weapons, and small personal transports. They build to inspire, not to intimidate. The past months had been a time of profound change for the former War Marshal. After agreeing to Sarah Chen's terms, he had returned to Kralaxian space to find the military hierarchy in chaos. His report of dragons manifesting from human mythology had been met with disbelief, ridicule, and accusations of cowardice. It was only when other fleets encountered similar phenomena around human installations that the Empire began to take his warning seriously. The Kralaxian High Command had initially planned a massive retaliatory strike, assembling the largest fleet in their history to crush the human threat once and for all. The plan was abandoned when their deep space scouts reported that human colonies were now guarded by creatures that existed partially outside normal space-time. Entire star systems were protected by beings that their best scientists couldn't classify or understand. "Incoming transmission," reported their communications officer. "It's from a station." "Put it through," Zeth Krar ordered. Sarah Chun appeared on the main screen, looking exactly as she had during their first encounter. She was sitting in what appeared to be another library, though this one was even larger than the facility on Valderan Prime. Behind her, beings of dozens of different species moved quietly among the stacks, engaged in research and study. "Ambassador Zeth Krar," she said warmly. "Welcome to New Alexandria. I trust your journey was pleasant." The former war marshal still struggled with the casual way humans addressed him. In Kralaxian society, titles and hierarchy were everything. But Sarachin spoke to him as if they were equals, despite representing a species that could apparently summon mythological beings to defend their interests. "The journey was educational," he replied carefully. "Your space lanes are remarkably peaceful." Sarah smiled. "That's because everyone who travels through them knows they're protected. Pirates and raiders tend to avoid areas where dragons have been sighted. It's remarkably effective for maintaining order without actually needing to patrol." Besides Zethkrar, Raxtai leaned forward with interest. "Are there dragons stationed throughout human space?" "Not stationed," Sarah corrected gently. "They go where they're needed. Dragons have their own agenda, you know? They're not pets or weapons. They're independent entities who've chosen to associate with humanity because they approve of what we're trying to accomplish." The docking process was unlike anything the Kralaxians had experienced. Instead of harsh mechanical clamps and pressurized tubes, their ship was gently guided into a berth by what appeared to be living tendrils of energy. The boarding tube that extended to meet them was transparent, allowing them to see the station's interior as they moved through it. "Fascinating biotechnology," Raxtai observed. "Actually, it's not technology at all." Sarah's voice came through the tube's communication system. "New Alexandria is what we call a living station. It's actually a spaceborne organism that we've formed a symbiotic relationship with. It provides shelter and protection. We provide it with interesting experiences and new forms of knowledge to process." Zethkrar paused in the middle of the boarding tube. "You mean this entire station is alive?" "Very much so. Her name is Alexandria, and she's quite excited to meet you. She's never had Kralaxian visitors before, and she's very curious about your culture." The moment they stepped into the station proper, Zethkrar understood what Sarah meant. The walls pulsed gently with a rhythm that resembled a heartbeat, and the air carried a scent that was somehow both alien and welcoming. More importantly, he could sense intelligence in the station itself, a vast presence that observed them with benevolent curiosity. "Hello." A voice spoke directly into their minds, warm and feminine and utterly alien. "I am Alexandria. Welcome to my body. Please don't be alarmed if the corridors shift occasionally. I'm trying to optimize your path to the library based on your physiological requirements and interests." The Kralaxian delegation exchanged glances of amazement and concern. The idea of living inside a sentient being was completely outside their cultural experience. Sarah Chan appeared around a corner, walking toward them with the same calm demeanor she had displayed while under siege. "Don't worry," she said, noting their discomfort. "Alexandria is completely benign. She's a knowledge seeker, like us. The only thing that makes her aggressive is the deliberate destruction of information." She led them through corridors that seemed to adjust themselves as they walked, walls becoming more opaque when the Kralaxians showed signs of vertigo from the transparent sections, gravity subtly shifting to accommodate their physiology. The station was adapting to them in real time, learning their preferences and adjusting accordingly. "This is the main library," Sarah announced as they entered a space so vast that its far walls disappeared into misty distance. The ceiling was a dome of living crystal that showed real-time views of the cosmos beyond, with stars and nebulae shifting in a slow, hypnotic dance. Zethkar had seen impressive structures before. Kralaxian architecture favored massive monuments to military might, buildings designed to intimidate and awe. But this library was different. It was designed to inspire wonder, to make visitors feel small not in a way that diminished them, but in a way that reminded them of how much there was to discover. How many volumes? Raxtai asked, his voice barely a whisper. Approximately 47 million texts in various formats, representing the knowledge of 322 different species, Sarah replied. Plus another 112 million archived experiences, memory matrices, and forms of information storage that don't translate well to traditional books. A new voice joined the conversation, speaking in perfectly accented Kralaxian. And we're always looking for more. They turned to see Vexhai, the insectoid scholar who had been present during the first encounter with Pyraxis. His compound eyes gleamed with excitement as he approached the delegation. Scholar Vexhai, Zethkar said, recognizing him. You survived the encounter. More than survived, Vexhai replied enthusiastically. I was offered a position as a xenocultural researcher here at New Alexandria. I've been studying the intersection of mythology and reality in human culture for 3 months now. The implications are staggering. Sarah gestured for them to follow her deeper into the library. As they walked, they passed beings of dozens of species, all engaged in quiet study or animated discussion. Zethkar noticed that despite the diversity of forms present, there was no sense of tension or hostility. Species that were mortal enemies in their home systems worked peacefully side by side here. How do you maintain order? He asked. Some of these species have been at war for centuries. Simple, Sarah replied. This is neutral ground. Everyone who enters agrees to abide by library rules. No violence, no politics, no attempts to recruit others for external conflicts. Anyone who breaks those rules gets banned, and the ban is enforced by Alexandria herself. And if they refuse to leave, Sarah's smile grew slightly predatory. Then they meet Pyraxis. But that's only happened twice in the station's history, and both times the offenders were simply relocated to empty space with enough life support to reach the nearest inhabited system. Dragons may be fierce, but they're not cruel. They pass through sections dedicated to different forms of knowledge. A vast chamber where holographic displays showed the evolution of musical traditions across the galaxy. Another area where researchers could experience historical events through carefully preserved memory matrices. A section where pure mathematical concepts were given physical form for easier study. This is what humans do, Sarah explained as they walked. We don't just collect information. We find ways to make it accessible, to help different species understand concepts that might be foreign to their natural thinking processes. Knowledge without understanding is just data. They eventually arrived at a smaller, more intimate section of the library. Here, comfortable seating areas were arranged around displays showing various aspects of human culture. Zethkar was surprised to see several displays dedicated to Kralaxian military history, but presented in a context he had never considered. You study our warfare? He asked. Of course, Sarah said. Kralaxian tactical doctrine has influenced military thinking across 3 sectors of space. Your people are remarkably innovative when it comes to coordinated assault strategies. We're trying to understand if those same organizational principles could be applied to peaceful endeavors. Vexhai activated one of the displays, showing a complex simulation. Look at this, Ambassador. Human researchers have been analyzing Kralaxian logistics networks. The efficiency with which your empire can coordinate resource distribution across vast distances is unparalleled. Imagine if that same system were used to distribute medicine during plague outbreaks or food during famines. Zethkar stared at the display, watching familiar military protocols being adapted for humanitarian purposes. You see our warfare as a tool for peace. We see everything as a potential tool for peace, Sarah corrected gently. The same drive that makes your people effective conquerors could make you equally effective builders. The discipline that creates mighty warriors could just as easily create devoted teachers or researchers or healers. Raxtai had wandered to a nearby display showing dragon lore from various human cultures. Librarian Shun, may I ask about the creatures that defended your library? How many of them exist? Sarah considered the question carefully. That's difficult to answer. Dragons exist in the spaces between what is real and what is believed to be real. Every time humans tell a story about dragons, we strengthen the conceptual framework that allows them to manifest. There could be dozens or thousands or potentially unlimited numbers. And they all serve humanity? They don't serve us, Sarah said firmly. They partner with us. The relationship is symbiotic. We provide them with purpose and stories to inhabit. They provide us with protection and wisdom that spans cosmic ages. It's a friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. A gentle chime sounded through the library, and Alexandria's voice spoke to them. Forgive the interruption, but I thought the ambassador would be interested to know that we've just received a transmission from Kralaxian space. It appears your high command wishes to speak with you. Zethkrar felt his stomach tighten. He had been expecting this communication, but he had hoped for more time to understand what he had experienced before having to explain it to his superiors. Would you like to take the call privately? Sarah asked. No, Zethkrar said after a moment's consideration. I think it would be beneficial if they could see where I am and what I've learned. Sarah led them to a communication station, and soon the familiar form of High Admiral Vekmar appeared on the screen. The Admiral's expression was a mixture of impatience and barely controlled anger. War Marshal Zethkrar, the Admiral began, then paused as he took in the surroundings. Where exactly are you? I am in the New Alexandria Research Station, Admiral, Zethkrar replied formally. I am fulfilling the terms of the cultural exchange agreement you approved. And what have you learned from this exchange? Zethkrar took a deep breath. I have learned that we have been thinking about galactic civilization in entirely the wrong way, Admiral. I have learned that there are forms of power that make our fleets look like children's toys. And I have learned that the humans are offering us a chance to become something greater than we ever imagined possible. The Admiral's 4 eyes narrowed dangerously. Explain. For the next hour, Zethkrar described everything he had seen and learned. He spoke of living stations and dragon councils, of libraries that spanned dimensions, and species that had chosen cooperation over conquest. He explained how human mythology had become living reality and how that reality was now reshaping the balance of power throughout the galaxy. When he finished, the Admiral was silent for a long time. And you believe all of this? Vekmar finally asked. Admiral, Zethkrar said quietly, I have seen our most powerful weapons rendered useless by a single creature that exists because humans decided it should exist. I have walked inside a living space station that adapts to the needs of its inhabitants. I have witnessed cooperation between species that should be impossible. I don't just believe it, Admiral. I've experienced it. The Admiral looked past Zethkrar to where Sarah Chun stood quietly waiting. Human, he said, is your offer genuine? This possibility of evolution rather than conquest. Sarah stepped forward, her expression serene but serious. It is, Admiral, but it requires a fundamental change in how your people view the universe. You'll have to give up the idea that might makes right and accept that wisdom might be more powerful than weapons. And if we refuse, Sarah's smile was sad but understanding. Then you'll continue as you have until you encounter something that destroys you. The universe is full of surprises, Admiral. Eventually, every empire that depends on force alone meets something that can't be conquered. The transmission ended with the Admiral promising to consider what he had heard. Zethkrar found himself hoping that his people would choose the path of growth rather than the familiar path of destruction. Do you think he'll listen? Raxtai asked. Sarah looked out through the crystal dome at the stars beyond. I think your people are at a crossroads, Ambassador. Every species reaches this point eventually. The choice between growing beyond what they were or remaining trapped by what they've always been. And if we choose growth, then you'll discover what every species in this library has learned. That the universe is far more wonderful than you ever imagined, and that there's always something new to discover when you stop trying to conquer everything you encounter. As if summoned by her words, a familiar presence made itself known. Pyraxis materialized in the space outside the library. His massive form curled around the station like a protective embrace. Through the crystal dome, they could see his ancient golden eyes regarding them with benevolent amusement. "Hello again, little warriors," the dragon's voice spoke gently into their minds. "Welcome to the beginning of wisdom." 2 years had passed since the first Kralaxian delegation visited New Alexandria, and the galaxy was witnessing changes that would have seemed impossible just a few short cycles before. Ambassador Zethkrar stood in the observation deck of the newest addition to the station, a wing specifically designed for Kralaxian scholars who had come to study what humans called cooperative civilization theory. The irony was not lost on him. His people, once the most feared military force in 3 sectors, were now sending their brightest minds to learn from the same humans they had once planned to conquer. But the transformation hadn't been smooth or universal. Ambassador, called Dr. Raxtai, his former weapons officer who had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of any Kralaxian. The massive warrior had retrained himself as a xenopsychologist, and now wore the simple robes of a scholar rather than military armor. "You need to see the latest reports from the border systems." Zethkrar accepted the data pad with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The Kralaxian Empire had effectively split into 2 factions following his initial reports. The Progressive Coalition, led by High Admiral Vekmar himself, had embraced the human model of cooperative expansion. They were establishing research stations rather than military outposts, and their fleets now carried teachers and scientists rather than assault troops. But the traditional Dominion, under the leadership of War Marshal Esikadar, had rejected everything Zethkrar had learned. They viewed the Progressive Coalition as traitors and weaklings who had been brainwashed by human sorcery. 3 months ago, they had launched what they called the Purification Campaign, attempting to reclaim Kralaxian colonies that had joined the Progressive faction. "How bad is it?" Zethkrar asked as he scanned the reports. 6 systems lost to orbital bombardment, Raxtai replied grimly. Esikadar's forces aren't just conquering Progressive colonies, they're destroying them completely. Libraries burned, research stations vaporized, anyone who collaborated with humans executed as a traitor. Zethkrar closed his eyes in pain. The very knowledge and progress his people had worked so hard to achieve was being systematically destroyed by their own kind. It was everything he had feared when he first returned to Kralaxian space with tales of dragons and living libraries. "There's more," Raxtai continued. "Intelligence reports suggest that Esikadar has formed an alliance with 3 other conquest-based species: the Hegemony of Iron, the Void Corsairs, and the Crimson Covenant. They're calling it the Dominion Alliance, and their stated goal is the complete elimination of what they term the human corruption." Through the observation deck's transparent walls, Zethkrar could see New Alexandria's latest expansion. The living station had grown enormously over the past 2 years, adding sections to accommodate researchers from dozens of species. Gardens of living crystal grew alongside laboratories where beings studied the intersection of science and mythology. In the distance, 3 dragons could be seen engaged in what appeared to be a scholarly debate, their forms shimmering as they existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human imagination had made real. "They have no idea what they're challenging," Zethkrar murmured. "Don't they?" asked a familiar voice from behind them. Sarah Chan approached carrying a stack of books, looking exactly as calm and untroubled as she had during the first crisis. "I think they understand perfectly. That's what makes them dangerous." The human librarian set her books down on a nearby reading stand and activated a holographic display showing current galactic political alignments. The map was a patchwork of colors representing different factions, but the pattern was clear. Species aligned with human cooperative principles were shown in blue, traditional conquest-based empires in red, and neutral systems in gray. Sekdar isn't stupid, Sarah continued. He recognizes that what we represent is an existential threat to everything his civilization has built itself on. If the idea spreads that cooperation is more effective than conquest, then military hierarchies become obsolete. Warriors become redundant. Everything that gives his culture meaning and purpose disappears. So this is a war for the soul of galactic civilization, Raxtai observed. Not a war, Sarah corrected gently. Wars are fought between equals using similar methods. This is something different. This is evolution facing extinction, and extinction fighting back with everything it has. As if summoned by her words, Alexandria's consciousness spoke to them through the station's living walls. Sarah, we're receiving emergency transmissions from the Altair Research Collective. They're under attack by a massive Dominion Alliance fleet. Estimated force strength is over 2,000 vessels. Zethkar felt his blood run cold. The Altair Collective was a joint human-Kralaxian research facility where both species worked together to develop new forms of peaceful technology. It was also home to nearly 500,000 civilians, including many Kralaxian families who had chosen the path of cooperation. 2,000 ships, he whispered. That's larger than any fleet we ever assembled during our conquest period. Sarah activated her personal communicator. Pyraxis, are you available for consultation? The ancient dragon's voice responded immediately, though his physical form was nowhere to be seen. Always, dear librarian. I take it our friends in the Extinction faction are making themselves known. The Altair Collective is under attack. Massive force, probably planning complete sterilization of the system. There was a pause, and Zethkar could almost feel the weight of cosmic intelligence considering the situation. How many innocents? Nearly 500,000, plus irreplaceable research and cultural archives. And how many aggressors? Sarah checked the tactical display. Conservative estimate, 12 million military personnel across 2,000 warships. Another pause, longer this time. When Pyraxis spoke again, his voice carried a note that Zethkar had never heard before. It was sadness mixed with inevitability, the sound of an ancient being accepting a necessary but unpleasant duty. I see. And they've chosen to attack a facility specifically dedicated to peaceful research and cultural exchange. Yes, including archives containing the history and literature of multiple species. Yes, very well. The Dragon Council will convene immediately. This cannot be permitted to continue. The communication ended, and the observation deck fell silent. Zethkar had witnessed the power of individual dragons, but he had never seen the full council mobilize for war. He wasn't entirely certain he wanted to. What will happen? Raxtai asked quietly. Sarah picked up one of her books, a worn volume about the history of human warfare. Something that should have been avoided, she said sadly. The Dominion Alliance is about to learn why humans stopped believing in monsters. They're about to meet the things that make monsters wake up screaming. 6 hours later, the emergency session of the Dragon Council concluded with a decision that would reshape galactic politics forever. Aeon, the eldest dragon, spoke for the assembly as they prepared to depart for the Altair system. We have offered the gift of wisdom to all who would accept it, the ancient being declared, his voice carrying across multiple dimensions simultaneously. We have shown patience with those who choose ignorance over knowledge. But the deliberate destruction of libraries, the murder of scholars, the targeting of those who seek only to learn and grow, this crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. Pyraxis materialized beside New Alexandria, his massive form somehow managing to convey both regret and determination. The offer of evolution remains open to any who wish to accept it, but those who choose extinction will have their choice honored. The space around the station began to fill with dragons. Not just the familiar forms that had been seen before, but creatures from every story humans had ever told about justice, wisdom, and the protection of the innocent. There was the rainbow serpent from Aboriginal Dreamtime, whose scales contained the colors of creation itself. The feathered serpent of Mesoamerican legend descended through dimensions where time moved differently. Asian lung dragons arrived, carrying the weight of 5,000 years of stories about harmony and balance. But most terrifying of all was the arrival of the apocalypse dragons, the creatures from human stories about the end of worlds. These were beings that existed in the spaces between myth and nightmare, dragons that represented not just power, but the inevitable consequence of choosing destruction over creation. "My God," Raxtai whispered, watching the assembly through the observation deck. "How many are there?" "Every story," Sarah replied quietly. "Every tale humanity has ever told about dragons protecting what matters most. They're all here, and they're all very, very angry." Zethkrar watched in fascination and terror as the Dragon Council prepared for war. This wasn't the casual demonstration of power that had ended the original Kralaxian threat. This was the full mobilization of forces that existed beyond the normal understanding of physics, beings that could reshape reality through the sheer weight of human belief and imagination. The dragons began to sing, and their song was unlike anything that had been heard before. It wasn't the harmonious music they had created during peaceful moments. This was a dirge for civilizations that had chosen to remain trapped in cycles of violence and destruction. It was a lament for the unnecessary deaths that were about to occur, and a warning to any who might consider following the same path. "Will any of them survive?" Zethkrar asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sarah considered the question carefully. "That depends on whether they're capable of learning, even in the face of overwhelming force. The dragons don't seek genocide, Ambassador. They seek the end of a way of thinking that threatens the growth and development of all civilizations." The assembly began to move, not through normal space, but through the conceptual frameworks that connected all human colonies. They would arrive at Altair not as invading forces, but as the inevitable consequence of choosing extinction over evolution. "What happens after?" Raxtai asked. "If the Dominion Alliance is defeated, what becomes of species that have built their entire identity around conquest?" "The same thing that happens to any species when their old way of life becomes obsolete," Sarah replied. "They adapt or they disappear. The choice is always theirs to make." As the dragons departed for Altair, Sarah returned to her reading, opening a book about the reconstruction of civilizations after major cultural transitions. Around them, New Alexandria continued its work of preserving knowledge and fostering cooperation between species. Life went on, but everyone understood that the galaxy was about to change in ways that would echo through cosmic history. In the Altair system, War Marshal Esikadar received his first report of dragon manifestations with disbelief that quickly turned to terror. His massive fleet, the largest military force ever assembled by the Dominion Alliance, found itself facing beings that existed outside every tactical manual ever written. The battle was brief, decisive, and educational. When it was over, the surviving members of the Dominion Alliance would carry a message to every conquest-based civilization in the galaxy. Evolution was not optional. The universe itself favored growth over stagnation, creation over destruction, and wisdom over warfare. Those who chose to align themselves with these forces would find friends and allies beyond their wildest imagination. Those who chose extinction would discover that the universe was remarkably efficient at honoring such requests. Back at New Alexandria, Sarah Chun continued reading her book about post-war reconstruction, occasionally making notes about civilizations that had successfully transitioned from military conquest to peaceful cooperation. Around her, researchers from dozens of species worked together to unlock the mysteries of existence, protected by forces that turn mythology into reality through the simple act of believing that wisdom deserved to be defended. The library was quiet, peaceful, and eternal. It was exactly as it should be, exactly as human imagination had dreamed it could be, and exactly as the dragons had always known it would become. In the end, that was what human stories had always been about. Not the monsters, but the hope that someday, somewhere, there would be a place where knowledge was valued above conquest, where wisdom triumphed over warfare, and where anyone could sit quietly with a good book while the universe rearranged itself around the simple principle that learning was better than destroying. The human librarian turned a page and smiled.